Hello everyone, my name is Siva Nandasiva, I'm the Chief Analyst here at the King's Fund, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this, our latest King's Fund online event. And today's event is supported by NHS Property Services. Today, our session will focus on technology and the NHS estate. So let me tell you a little bit about how the session is going to run. We've got about an hour together with our expert panel for questions and answers, and I'll introduce the panel in just a moment. We'll start with a few questions the team here at the King's Fund has prepared just to get the conversation started. But there's got to be some incentive for you tuning in live, giving up part of your lunch break. And the incentive is that you get to drive the session. So you will see on your webpage that there is a box at the bottom of your screen where you can input questions. And you can start doing that right now. And as I said, it's those questions that will really drive the bulk of this session. I look forward to a good, fruitful discussion. And if you want, you can follow the conversation as well on Twitter at #KFOnline. But you didn't come to hear me, you came to hear the panel, so let's introduce them. And I'm delighted that we're joined by three experts, Adam, Karina and Robert. Could we start with you introducing yourselves briefly?
Hi, I'm Adam Wright. I'm from NHS Providers. I'm a Senior Policy Officer there. And NHS Providers is the membership body and trade association for all foundation trusts and trusts in England.
Hi, I'm Karina Dare. I work for NHS Property Services, and we work on optimising the primary care and community estate. We have about 10% of the healthcare estate.
Hi, good morning. I'm Robert Broad. I'm a senior consultant with Philips Healthcare, working in their Hospital Integration and Planning Solutions Group. We provide innovation and technological solutions for hospital facility design and planning.
Good to meet you all. And I'm going to do something that I hate when chairs do it, but I'm going to big you up, because what you want from this sort of session is people who are on top of their brief and can talk about that brief in a lively and interesting way, and we've got three of those people. So let's start with an open question for all of you. And we're here to talk about technology in the NHS estate. If I'm being honest, I have lots of conversations about technology and lots of conversations about the NHS estate. Very rarely do we talk about the two together. So could you say a little bit about why, in your experience, it's important to have this as a single plan, a single conversation, technology and the estate together? Adam, could I start with you?
Yeah, sure. So just to say, within the provider sector at the moment, and in secondary care, lots of trusts and foundation trusts are already beginning to talk about estates and technology together. So at board level, ultimately a lot of the time it's the finance director who tends to take responsibility for both estates and technology. And for trusts, ultimately what this comes down to is a conversation about quality of care and patient experience, and as we move further into the 21st century, what are patients' expectations in terms of their experience when receiving care. There's also an element around cost and efficiency as well, which we'll get into, I'm sure, later, which this topic covers.
I think I'll pick up on what you were talking about in terms of cost and efficiency, and certainly in the primary and community estate, the changing technologies and the changing workforce issues mean that the way that patients are seen, the way that buildings are used is changing, and also the scarce capital resources mean that we want to get more and more out of a smaller footprint. We want to reduce costs in buildings and make sure money's going into services. So it's absolutely fundamental that the technology is there to support that and to support flexible use of space.
Robert?
Indeed, I think the estates are facing a multitude of sort of competing and conflicting influences with technology as they try to provide for the hospitals and the community the platform to deliver their service. There's the technology stemming from the equipment itself. As this gets more complex, there is the impact on the build, the infrastructure, space needed. There's the movement in information technologies now towards big data, cloud computing and e-health and home health care. And there's changes in the way that the patients are treated, the treatment pathways, and the estates have to encompass all of this in the design of the facility, the platform to provide this service to the community. So I think it's essential that estates and the technology providers and the clinicians integrate this in their planning right from the outset.
Great. And what's interesting is, to be honest, these could seem like quite dry subjects, technology and the NHS estate, but you all mentioned patients and changes to how care is delivered. you all mentioned staff and changes to how they do their job. And those are some of the themes I think we'll be coming back to later on. But you also mentioned the scarce capital resources. So let's talk about the climate for technology and capital investment in the States at the moment. And Adam, your job takes you close to the national cut and thrust of politics and policy. What's your overall perspective on the climate for technology and capital in the States at the moment? Are you optimistic?
I'm optimistic, yeah. So there's ultimately opportunities and there's challenges facing our members when it comes to estates and technology. So let me deal with the opportunities first. There's kind of three main strands is how I like to think about estates and technology. The first is around kind of the smart buildings and kind of tracking of both patients, equipment, and sometimes staff as well, which optimises the care delivered within a hospital. Secondly, the second opportunity really is around reducing that reducing reliance on the current NHS estates. So that we're thinking about telemedicine, kind of virtualisation of care, and there's some great examples we can talk about shortly as well. And then the third is kind of the third opportunity for trusts really is around kind of enhancing their staff's capability to perform their role. So kind of I'm thinking about industrial scale Wi-Fi, for example. In terms of the challenges, well, we've already talked about capital and the funding for these schemes, and ultimately for trusts, capital has been, for a number of years, capital funding has been problematic for them. It's been difficult for them to access capital money and fund what they would want to see in terms of transforming their estates and bringing in some of these new technologies. There's also a secondary issue in terms of funding around income and the way the current national tariff funds some kind of innovation, so particularly around the current outpatient funding model. And then I guess the third challenge is, as the recent King's Fund report on digital change recently highlighted, this is bringing about digital change involves bringing a cultural change as well, and that involves a lot of engagement with your workforce and making sure you have the right skill sets to bring about some of these desired changes and opportunity and realise the opportunities.
Great, thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned the culture change, because technology estates, again, they're not just technical changes we're talking about. We're talking, if we pull it off, fundamental changes to how people do their jobs. So just on that first issue, or in your typology that you mentioned, the smart buildings, where potentially you track assets, you track staff, you track patients using technology. From what you've seen of your members, what are some of the cultural issues that can throw up, and how have they been addressed?
Yeah, so for example, there's two great examples that come to mind, and I'm sure lots of people know about them already. The Countess of Chester and Royal Wolverhampton, who've done particularly a lot of stuff around digital patient flow. And an example I've heard from the Countess of Chester is they have an Uber pooling system for their porters. So ultimately, they get notified when kind of a job is nearby, and that means that those porters can react much faster to where they're needed. But obviously that's quite a different change in working pattern for them. And so there's been a lot of dialogue with staff involved in some of these changes, and a lot of engagement in explaining why these benefits are useful to both them and also the patient, and improving ultimately the patient experience.
Thank you. So tackling culture change as well as the technical change. Karina, Robert, do you share Adam's optimism when it comes to accepting it's not a capital-rich environment for the moment? Do you share his optimism about the opportunities here? And what have you seen from your personal experience of what people are doing to deliver change? Karina?
I think certainly in the primary and community sector, we're not seeing yet some of those developments in terms of what they're doing with the control centre. That's not to say it won't come. Certainly we have 150 hospitals, community hospitals in our portfolio, and actually they're using similar resources. So I think over time we'll see some movement. To some extent, we're seeing some of the utilisation and management questions being driven by cost pressures and scarce capital resources. So we are using some of those technologies around sessional booking. So trying to establish a national, we've had a national pilot running where we've been testing how you book and use space more efficiently, instead of someone putting their name on the door and locking it when they go home, trying to get the best use out of assets using technology to book that space. So we've got something called NHS open space that we're starting to use, and that could spread more broadly because people want more flexible space, but it has to be the right kind of space. So I think there's when you have scarce resources, it drives change in a way, but that's a twofold change. And I think the cultural elements, changing the way people work, is just as big a challenge as getting the technical solution in place for that. So I think I have some optimism that we'll see better use of infrastructure, and that'll present opportunities then for us to release capital through disposals and other activities that will enable the next round of investment. But I think that's emerging now. There's much more pressure on use of resource and expensive estate, and you see it in both acute sector. They're getting much more I was trying to think what the right word, much more assertive in managing their own space and understanding who's using it, and trying to avoid the natural creep that happens in buildings where a room's left alone for 2 weeks and suddenly it's acquired, you know. So we see that in our estate as well, and working with our customers trying to manage that better is an important part of the whole process, I think.
You mentioned booking of sessional space and management of the estate's portfolio. A lot of the times when we talk about technology in estates, we get drawn to, again, I'm not sure what the right word is, but perhaps a more glamorous end of the spectrum, artificial intelligence and the impact of all these technologies. But from what you were saying, a lot of the opportunity seems to be on the day-to-day operational management of services and improving that. So how have the places you've worked with managed to make that as much a priority as the shiny new thing, to put it crudely?
Well, I think probably because I'm focused in the primary and community estate, and actually the most expensive resource there is probably people and the building itself. So mostly people and workforce. So as workforce pressures occur and as you've got less money to invest in new shiny building solutions, you have to start saying, well, what can we do with what we have? So how can we recycle this? What's the best way to use it? So I think it's probably the nature of the primary and community estate that I'm used to dealing with, and also general practice. But I think general practice is being affected by new technologies and AI in a different way in terms of the flow of people through. If you're doing online consultations, you'll see a different flow of patients through your facilities, and your mix of patients will change. So it's about how does your building respond to, how do you get to the infrastructure you have to respond to that. So if you're young, fit, technology, happy patient is happy to do FaceTime with you, but you've got an older patient group who have got multiple conditions and need a bit more time and a bit more focus, then actually the patients that are coming into your estate are going to change, and it's how you respond to that, really.
Thank you.
I think it's important to remember in the for trusts and foundation trusts in secondary care, ultimately, if you were to start from scratch, you look at somewhere like, I think in Qatar they've got a new medical city, which is what you'd do if you just had a kind of blank canvas. But obviously for the NHS, a lot of hospitals occupy buildings that are kind of over 100 years old, and ultimately there's a limited, we talked about the limited resource to fund some of these changes, but there's also kind of restrictions in terms of what they can do with the space they currently occupy as well, and that's obviously important to remember.
quite a pragmatic optimist. Robert,
Yeah,
you've
I
got
think
a lot
that's the estate's dilemma, that new build, of course, new design is far simpler to build in new technology, new treatment pathways, but of course the trusts are faced with aging buildings, and of course they're strapped in the sense of limited investment available. They want to optimize and get better efficiency of staff, workflows, and better utilization of the space. But within that envelope, they're tasked to introduce new technologies, new treatment pathways, and that sort of thing. Of course, traditionally, the estates relies on the health building notes, the HTMs, which are very good in themselves. But the problem with those, they're not keeping pace with the technological developments and changes to the way patients are presenting at hospitals with home care, e-health, those sort of things. They are, say, behind the curve. So really the estates needs to find a way, a mechanism, a technology that will help them look at how they can optimize the space they've got, optimize use of staff, better workflows, patient experience. And one of the things I'd like to talk about is the fact that a lot of changes to existing facilities are more on just a committee-based decision, a consensus of opinion that maybe if we change this or that, it should improve matters. But there's no real way at present of testing this, of validating that. From our perspective, from Philips, we've introduced simulation, dynamic simulation and modeling, where we can actually model a department, existing or proposed future development, and we can see how that will actually run in real time. And we model this on the actual layout of the department. We can model the various entities using the department, staff, patients. And this way, it's a fairly low-cost way of the trust being able to explore options, to test them, to stress test those options, and perhaps validate. And it also gives them the advantage to be able to go to the board or the financial controller with some evidence-based data that this investment, this change to the process, or this purchase of this equipment will deliver the improvements to service delivery that they were looking for.
And you've spoken in the past a little bit about how this requires a very different way of thinking about design and strategy and planning. Did you want to say a little bit about that?
Indeed. I think it should be tipped on its head to an extent, that you look at the service delivery rather than looking at prescribed guidance that a department, OPD or OR should have a certain number of rooms of a certain size. I think it should be done from the other aspect. You should look at what are you trying to deliver, what is the objectives, the capacity, the output, and then you work back building from the service delivery model, the structure, the infrastructure, the spaces you need. And in doing that also, you can take into account technologies, different equipments, different diagnostic techniques, but you can also model that. That's what I'm very interested in, that you can, it's try before you buy philosophy, if you like. A lot of, say, adaptations to hospital buildings, they are done hoping it will work. But where is the proof? Where is the validation? And can you also stress test it for events that, like a surge event, mass casualty appearing at the A&E, or equipment downtime? Maybe your sterilizer goes down or an imaging room goes down. What impact does that have on the actual service model? Can you still deliver within the core shift hours, the throughput, the treatments that you plan to do, or has it got some fundamental impact? If it has, it causes a bottleneck, you can look at your design in terms of resilience and maybe amend that. But this is before you commit to a lot of external architectural design, construction cost, MEP, consultant design, and even construction works. So it gives you a chance to validate your ideas, try before you buy.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of risk in staying still, and there's a lot of risk in the status quo, but there's also risk in change. Something like simulation modeling helps the client or the customer or whoever you're trying to convince de-risk the initiative. What are some of the other things that you've seen to help either build the case for change, for doing something different with technology and the estate? What was it that created the burning platform?
So there's lots of different drivers, and I think just even for our members, just hearing what other people are doing is, whenever you get the council to Chester present their digitalised patient flow on stage, you get lots of very interested people in the audience. My second point about around kind of virtualisation and telemedicine as an opportunity here is one of the key drivers is geography. So it's not really a problem, obviously, here in London. However, kind of other parts of the NHS, in particularly more rural areas, a lot of their patients will struggle to get from their GP practice in the morning to their acute hospital within the same day. There's rural routes and kind of longer journey times, and for telemedicine obviously offers the opportunity for patients to not have to travel those distances, and obviously saves them costs in terms of travel as well. So I know, for example, University Hospitals Morecambe Bay have done something around this area where they've got a GP practice in I think the town's called Millom, that has telemedicine linked to the emergency department in the I think it's Furness District Hospital, and allows them to triage via that video link. So for them, the driver is geography, and for lots of trusts in more rural areas, I think that's the way they're looking at the opportunities in around estates and technology.
And I think the Millom is a good example as well, because the GP has now moved into the Millom site, so you're getting that consolidation of services, maximising the use of that facility. So there was some vacant space in the hospital, there were some issues with the existing GP practice, so the GP's now moved into that facility, so you're getting the best use of the estate, you're co-locating your services and then using technology to link that. So I think it is a really good example of what works well.
And this is one of the classic examples of where technology can be used to move skills rather than people to support communities. Are you seeing that same benefit in more primary and community care settings? I
think that is happening, and certainly there's a lot of trials and useful activity around supporting care homes to reduce admissions. So, and that's technology led in the sense of actually just connecting up with the patient record and getting access to advice, having nursing staff go in just to reduce unnecessary admissions and provide support to the care homes. That's produced a lot of benefit, and I think there's actually what we're seeing is those sort of technological activities reducing demand for new buildings. I think that's the examples I can think of are where that's happening. I'm trying to think of any other examples. I've gone quiet now.
One of the things you said I found quite interesting, because you've both got quite strong experience of secondary care, and it may sound naive, but at least with secondary care you almost know who to talk to, who the key decision makers are, but maybe that's not the case anymore with STPs and ICSs and all the rest of it. But in primary and community care, is it easy to, if you're watching out there and you want to influence the decision maker, who are the people who are the decision makers, the key influencers when it comes to doing something differently with technology in the estate?
I think where I see it working is where you've got someone who's passionate about doing something and changing, usually responding to a problem, and actually the biggest blocker is actually the connectivity. So if you can resolve the connectivity issue or the shared patient record issue, then actually everything else becomes easier after that, because actually the technology is out there and there's probably more willingness in the patient population to use that technology than there is necessarily within to move staff, change the culture, get past the governance questions that everyone has about using the technology that's already there. So I think for us, what we are increasingly trying to do in some of our buildings is make sure that the space can be used for multiple uses, some more of the social prescribing types of activity. How do you make the buildings work for that broader range of we've got some links with some charities who we're trying to start working with and see how we open up some of the space that's already there more flexibly.
Future-proofing as well.
But I think the other interesting aspect is some of the stuff that's coming out of Healthy New Towns. So what does your built environment look like more broadly than core NHS buildings. How do you design your towns? I know in Darlington they are working on some healthy new town principles for some new housing developments. One of the key things they wanted to look at was what of the telemedicine activity can be done in people's homes, but what global infrastructure do you need in place from the beginning to make that work? How does your GP, your local community nurse access the patient record when they're going out into the community? And if we improve the fundamental infrastructure there for technology, does that make everything easier? Yeah, so I think it's some of those broader agendas and how the existing NHS estate fits into that, and not assuming that the built estate that we have is the only opportunity to do something interesting in technology.
It's a real challenge to think wider and broader. And something you said links back to a point you were making earlier about a more flexible use of space, a more flexible design, almost building in agility and future-proofing.
Indeed. In fact, if I can go to the slide just briefly, if we look here, you can see sort of a traditional health design process. It tends to be a bit fragmented with a strategy, followed by a design phase, followed by implementation and operation. But what you need to move to now is a completely integrated design process where all of these activities are intertwined and go on continually in parallel. Your strategy is continually driving your design, your space requirements, and your technology planning, and you have to look to future proofing. And as Katrina was saying, maybe developing not specific, say, outpatient rooms or consulting rooms. They are flex spaces that can be used by community nurses, by the GPs, by charitable organizations, those sort of things. So it becomes more of an open house then. And I think that's a change that has to come into the design process. It's, as you say, it's a wider thinking, not that it is prescribed use of room and that's all that room is used for. Yeah?
And that sounds entirely rational to me, but have you run into any difficulties in the places you've been supporting where it is so ingrained that this is a room that is a consulting room, it's always been a consulting room, it always will be?
Yeah, we do find that, yeah. And within the trust, there are some, say, there's, say, a resistance to change, particularly with office spaces, those sort of things where we're trying, in a particular project we're bidding on at the moment, we're trying to get more technology in than the actual space allows. That's what the clinicians want, but it's very difficult to persuade the trust to give up some other spaces to allow for that technology. So I think there has to be a more flexible thinking from the clinicians, the doctors, and also the board in the hospital as well. And in this particular instance, I won't name names, but there's something of the order of 100 square meters of so-called storage, but it is just a catastrophe. It is a room full of boxes and consumables and sterile material, and you can really see that with, say, a change in the philosophy of storage, high-density storage, distributed storage, they could free up a huge space, which they actually need to get a CT in, for argument's sake, and that's what they're looking at. Yeah, but that again is a sort of philosophy change. It's more of a commercial approach then, because there is no material management, logistics, just-in-time supply from the central store. I think the central store is cramped, so they decant everything to the wards and into the cath lab and cardiac ward, and then they become blocked as well. So it's not an efficient use of space. It's not an efficient use of managing your stock management, your material management, and it's actually preventing further development of the key services. That's what you want, the service delivery to do cardiac scans with the CT, not to have 100 square meters just jammed with boxes. This isn't very efficient.
Karina, did you want to come in?
Well, no, I was just thinking about the just-in-time management systems for the stock.
Yeah.
And again, it's the use of technology to minimise the use of built space for storage. You know, it's
Well, that 100 square
absolutely
meters costs a lot of money, and it's very inefficiently used. And if this could be distributed to other areas, I mean, this happens to be a cath lab situation. Actually, you could put high-density storage within the cath lab itself, yeah? Okay, that has an investment, but it means the staff aren't travelling so far to get the immediate material they need in the cath lab. It's there, ready, but all it needs is a mindset change, a philosophy change, how to manage that, how to stock that, maybe with some software tools so that you can have an inventory system that is automatically sending information to the main store that this needs restocking or resupplying. And then they could much better manage their department and efficient use of the space in their department.
Just on storage, a different kind of consideration here is around the implementation of electronic patient records. And again, I won't name the trusts I'm referring to here, but you know, one has been able to free up kind of several kind of storage areas where previously they would have held the their patient records, and that's a quick win for them in terms of space and in terms of freeing up some of their estate, and they are actually a London trust, so for them it's kind of any space is good, exactly, premium. And then I think we've spoken a little bit about radio frequency identification before as well, RFID, and we talked about equipment, but I know of another trust who have using RFID technology to actually track their patient notes. So you know, ultimately they would like to move to an electronic health record, but for the interim they're able to use RFID technology to know where their current notes are, which I think has been a problem previously for that trust.
And I hear a lot of the same examples. I'm always interested in what was it that led the board or whoever it was, the decision maker, to try this new thing. And one of the common themes is, well, we managed to get it as a priority for the board. We managed to push it up the agenda of the GP practice or the community provider. What tactics have you seen work effectively for pushing this agenda, technology in the States, up the priority of the leadership of organisations? Big question.
I think it's very much down to the heads of department. I think it's just their lobbying of the board within the trust to make change. You know? But of course, it's always constrained by the available funds for that particular trust, and they have calls on many different things within the trust environment. So, like sort of automated storage and high density storage, it's quite simple to implement, but it does come at a cost, and maybe with trust that cost is outweighed by a more urgent concern, maybe even just the cost to provide treatments or stents or something like this. So,
but the places you work with, it sounds like they started with maybe some low-hanging fruit, or like the examples you were talking about, storage. You prove that the business case works, that the approach works, and you can build on that with the credibility to do more and more and more and build some momentum.
I think that's where, say, simulation and modelling will help, because it will help department heads, estate managers to demonstrate there are ways to improve service, there are ways to improve efficiencies, or to free up space if a different technology, different philosophy for something like storage is employed. And with the modelling and simulation, there is some evidence. It's evidence-based. It can be presented to a board, to the financial controller. So you've got a justification rather than a more anecdotal approach. Yeah?
I think in a primary and community setting, what we're seeing is that those decisions are being forced by either workforce issues, so particularly in general practice, so reducing workforce or contracts being handed back precipitates some decisions about investment or consolidation, or failing infrastructure, so buildings that are at the end of their life and it's clear to everybody that a decision has to be taken, and sometimes that's quick and sometimes that's 5 years later, but it gets to a tipping point and that forces the decision. So I think it's quite a changing environment for NHS Capital and how that flows, and the role of STPs. And the whole question of where primary and community care investment sits in that competing against acute requirements and acute infrastructure that's also in some instances in a fairly poor state. So I think we'll see that over time we're seeing a real pressure on how much additional space, where exactly investment should be, and it's only going to be the highest priority items that actually get funded, and the rest is going to be revenue pressure. I don't know if you're seeing similar.
Yeah, definitely, and you know, I think within trusts, we've talked about the role of the board, but I think ultimately there's a lot of boards out there, a lot of trust boards out there at the moment that do get you understand the opportunity and the scale of the opportunity, and when you get kind of when you get leaders on boards that kind of are on board and kind of driving this change, it obviously makes things a lot easier. For example, you go to Milton Keynes, and the chief executive there is kind of Joe Harrison is kind of is very passionate about what they're doing there, particularly with their outpatients app. There's also lots of work going on within the NHS about digital leadership more generally, and that will kind of those will help. The kind of next generation of digital leaders will help to drive some of these changes. And I think for trust, a lot of it is about identifying their kind of digital champions within the trust as well, but below board level, which who kind of come up with the ideas and might have the suggestion or might have seen kind of a case study elsewhere and want to kind of implement something similar in their trust.
And I'm glad you mentioned Joe. He's a very powerful advocate for how technology can be used to transform clinical care. And one of the things he's done is almost take it out of the ghetto, take it out of a niche improvement area and say this is core to how we do business. One of the things that worries me, though, about hearing about all these good case studies is both the people and the organisations that are left behind. So it's a bit more of a philosophical question, but is it okay? Is it okay that there's some areas that are absolutely steaming ahead, pushing the frontier, and others that will probably be delivering care and using technology in the same way now as they will be in 5 to 10 years? Or should more be done to encourage them to catch up?
I think we need to be careful about the perceptions here. I mean, you know, I've spoken to trusts that aren't as advanced in this area. The aspiration is there for them to do more and transform their estates, and they know what the opportunities are. Ultimately, there's a number of issues. Number one being funding and being able to fund some of these changes. Which, if you're not a global digital exemplar, if you're not able to if you're not able to get hold of a loan or access any reserves to fund some of these schemes, then your opportunities are limited in terms of what you can do within the year. So I think we just need to consider that. Is it right that some are able to steam ahead? Well, it's the argument in the NHS about whether you let 1,000 flowers bloom or whether everyone should be kind of heading in the same direction at the same pace. Personally, I think the global digital exemplars and the fast followers programme is a good balance between letting kind of individual organisations forge a path and then quickly allowing others to follow and follow their best practice and their lessons learned.
I think the STP environment and development of ICSs will drive forward some change because it needs buy-in across a broader geographic area, and because they're trying to tackle scarce resources of capital and workforce. I think we'll see, or certainly from the ICSs and STPs I've been involved with around developing their estate strategy, they're starting to look broadly across their systems, and the requirement for interconnectivity and the requirement for a common platform to do business on across multiple sites, I think will start to move the whole conversation forward. Just because there aren't enough consultant, say, pathologists or there aren't enough oncologists to cover the whole geography, how can we do this once together? That will change the conversation, I think.
So I think if we'd been having this discussion maybe 5 years ago, most of it would have been focused on how you can run a well-run ship operationally using technology. But from what you've all been talking about, it's as much about looking out to other parts of the system to knit them together back to the connectivity you were talking about. going to pray in aid because I know a little bit about your backgrounds, and I know you have international experience. So, an open question. I don't want you to be put on the spot, but have you seen other countries that approach this issue better, and what can we learn from them? Or do you think the UK is an absolute pioneer in technology and estates and healthcare?
Well, I suppose my background, having spent sort of 39 years working in the overseas healthcare market, sort of prompts that kind of question, I think. I think by and large they're very similar. The big difference is the ratio of, say, state healthcare or the type of state healthcare in some countries versus private healthcare. And of course, in quite a few countries, private healthcare is the most relevant healthcare provider. And of course, they are constantly looking at development, technology, efficiencies. That's their reason for being in business. So that is quite different to the UK model, which is largely state-provided healthcare. I've spent the last 12 years in Holland, and I think the sort of difficulties and problems that the trusts are facing are not too dissimilar from what the Dutch hospitals face, which is cost constraints, lack of qualified staff, trying to find efficiencies and trying to find budget to implement new technology solutions. They know they're there, they know they will improve the service delivery or the patient experience. It's just freeing up funds to actually implement those. And very much what Adam was saying, it's some hospitals are leaders, optimizers in this field, others are, say, followers.
I think my experience in New Zealand is the response and the use of technology is driven by the geography and the same issues actually, the scarce resources of consultants and others. Even I worked for some time on the west coast of the South Island, which is a very small population over a massive geographic area where you can't recruit GPs. So actually you have community nurses, and I was just reading the other day that part of the response to that now is telemedicine links with a GP who's based maybe 4 hours away. So that supports those community nurses because the GP might go down for some consultations once a week, and the rest of the time the healthcare resources are a specialist nurse. So when you've got a very remote and spread population, you see some of that innovation happening because it has to.
Yeah. Which is probably as applicable to Morecambe Bay and Wales and many other parts of the UK.
Yeah. I don't have the international glittering career background to refer to, but if we're talking about NHS, looking to other areas for examples, outside of the industry, obviously retail and airports, kind of two other industries that where there are parallels between the opportunities in terms of estates and technology and so I know, for example, airports, there's a lot of work going on about kind of tracking lost baggage and kind of, again, we talk about patient flow, the flow of customers and shoppers in retail and airports as well. You can see there's parallels there and there's potential opportunities for the NHS to learn and share with those other industries. And
in fact, from office, the NHS is actually quite big users of office space, and not necessarily the most efficient users of office space, and actually that's often a quick win. We've got quite a few offices in our portfolio that are used by either by CCGs or provider trusts or others, and actually if you want to make savings, that's one of the nicer places to do it if you can do it well for your staff, because you don't want an environment that's not suitable for your staff. But actually the world of work has moved on, and the way people work and where they want to work has moved on. So using some of those lessons from industry and bringing them to health is an opportunity to maybe make some of the savings on space and cost that will fund some of the other initiatives that we want to see happen.
And right at the beginning of the discussion you spoke about perhaps the appetite from patients being there to see technology used and have a different mode of operating with services. And you can easily see a world where, yes, my baggage can be tracked in an airport. Why can't my patient notes be tracked as well? So when you look back at your experience, have you seen examples where it's patient-led, power or patient-led innovation that leads to technology being adopted or a change in the use of estates? Are there any examples you could talk through of that? I feel like I keep putting you on the spot.
Yes, I'm just thinking probably the obvious example is something like GP at hand, where you've got an innovation that's been used in other healthcare systems, that's been promoted here, and it's the patient buy-in that's taken them to their take-up of that has driven that change. It's patients' willingness to use those systems. There's all sorts of online consultation systems, the e-prescribing and other things. Yeah. Those are driving change, which is actually because the patients and the public want to use those systems. They're convenient and easy.
Yeah, I think the NHS needs to be very aware of public expectation about new technology, because you're absolutely right. Why is GP at hand there? Because people want to do things on their, well, not everyone, but certain people want to do things on their phone. And as ever, the NHS has always had to do this. Keeping up with what the expectations are in terms of patient experience. So whether that's kind of you go into lots of hospitals now that the atrium's there, and they've obviously got the reception area, but they've also got kind of an iPad or some sort of screen where they can click which department they need to go to, and then there's a map. And again, there's similar examples in retail. The parallels there again. So. I think trusts are very conscious of the patient experience and of the patient expectations about what their service should look like.
Well, it's some of the other technology, the apps, any kind of app. How many people track their diet and their run and their daily exercise and their sleep patterns on their phone? I mean, it's something that's part of a lot of people's everyday life. My husband's wake up and go to sleep times on his phone because he picks it up. I was recently at an interesting event where they were talking about how you use social media and the nudges of social media. So there's a trial on, I think, in London around people who have problems with sleep, and they work that out by using the social media like Facebook. And if people are constantly on during the night, they know that they're having issues with sleep. Yeah. And then they nudge them to perhaps go and seek help and support. It was really, really quite scary, but very interesting. Those public health links and the health links from those social media platforms was...
Well, we did joke beforehand that because we're talking about technology, there would be at least one technology issue. So we're going to move from the iPad to the laptop to take more questions. And there's an interesting one here from David about why is solar power and LED lighting not mandated for all new NHS builds? And there's the specifics of the question, but then there's also back to this question of to what extent can you mandate for change, and to what extent must it come from the organisations themselves? Adam, did you want to kick off, and then I'll come to you, Robert?
That's a really good question. Why isn't it mandated? I guess if you look at Foundation Trust, and Foundation Trust was set up to have a kind of a more independent and kind of autonomous approach to some of these decisions. So I don't know if legally or the regulations currently allow that sort of those sorts of mandates to be made. It's obviously an opportunity that the NHS could look more at in terms of solar-powered technology. So I think it's a good question, and again, it would be, I'm sure it would be playing on the minds of lots of chief executives and system leaders looking at new builds.
I think when you're looking at your design phase and you're looking at how you do things, you are driven by BREEAM and other considerations to start thinking about what technologies you put into your building. But perhaps that's something you're closer to than...
Indeed, I mean, BREEAM and LEED are sort of leading standards on energy resource management, green building, low carbon footprint, that sort of thing. But I'm surprised it isn't mandatory actually. And okay, the trusts are operating, say, autonomously, but I would have thought there would be core requirements within any contract they let, if it's a design build, that would be a requirement, a statutory requirement, that the designer supplier or the contractor has to demonstrate they've made the best efforts for energy resource management, LED lighting, proximity switching, heat recovery, all those elements, and solar power. There can be occasions, though, where the project is not, say, significantly big enough that the cost of implementing that technology really outweighs the benefit. I've had that overseas, in fact, in a particular case in Ghana, where we looked at things like solar heating for water, solar lighting for the public outside lighting, but actually the cost of that and more the sustainability and maintainability of that in that particular environment outweighed using it. So it wasn't employed in the end. But I would have thought it should have been a statutory requirement, although the trust can be autonomous and let contracts how they wish to let them. But the core framework of the contract should really include that, I think.
I think it's certainly in the primary and community care estate, any new builds have obligations in terms of the BREEAM requirements. It's about how you achieve those. And balancing the ongoing operating costs. I know we've got at least one BREEAM excellent property in our portfolio that had significant investment up front to try and make a longer term, more sustainable building. But it does take a real commitment, and I know over time we're looking at where LED lighting and other, as we invest and maintain the portfolio over time, what can we do to reduce those energy costs, and so certainly LED and other changes, we're looking at those.
And given the scale of the NHS estate and its, as you said, its unique place as a state provider, there's a real opportunity for the NHS to lead. In the switch from the laptop to from the iPad to the laptop, more questions have come through. And Karina, it's back to your point about broadening the debate, and a question here from Shaikh Ali about one public estate, room booking systems and management systems. Is there any opportunity there to implement the same sort of things we've been seeing on the NHS estate on a wider one public estate?
I think, well, there is opportunities. There's always an opportunity. The positive part of me thinks that doing something once is going to be more efficient. I think there's a lot of time and energy going into one public estate activities now, and working cooperatively across. Certainly, GM Greater Manchester are doing combined local asset reviews across each of their localities, and looking at where the opportunities arise to do things jointly across local authority, health and police, fire and others, and to some extent education. So I think that potentially works well on a smaller footprint. It's the scale of it that starts to, I think, become a challenge. Certainly the sessional booking system we're implementing, that would be available for other NHS organisations to use. I don't think we've thought about local authority at the moment, but that's not to say it isn't possible, because we wanted to have a system that was flexible and could expand. So there's certainly products out there that can do that for multiple sites, multiple organisations. It's about a collective will to do so, I guess.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm smiling slightly because Paul Cook wins the award for best use of quotation marks. Is there any thought on how boards, primarily led by clinicians, can be persuaded, and that's a word in quotation marks, to invest in technology rather than just seeing it as a necessary evil? And I smile because it reminds me of something my boss always says, which is, you mention technology to a clinician in the NHS and they often have a heart sink moment, understandably given some of the form. But that's not the case everywhere. So how do we change the culture, the perception, where we are, like you, talking about the opportunities, not the problems that inevitably come in any change program?
Yeah. So I think this is from the digital change report by the King's Fund. But one of the kind of the themes that came out in that report was never describe something as an IT project. It's a cultural change. It's a change to process. and I guess kind of a lot of this will come out in the engagement with staff, including clinicians. But obviously, you need to do it for the right reasons. So it's not about cutting costs. It's about improving patient care, improving the quality of care, and that is approaching that conversation in that way, rather than about cutting costs, about having to do this. That's going to be a more effective way to mobilise clinicians to adopt new ways of working. But I'd also say as well that the role of the Chief Clinical Information Officers within trusts, lots of trusts have CCIOs now, and in lots of trusts it is the CCIO that is obviously driving the digital and technology agenda, and they will have lots of ideas about how to best utilise the current estate with technology.
And again, it's coming back to what you've all been talking about, which is think of the patient, think of the staff, how they want to work, how they want to receive services, rather than just implementing technology or making a change for the sake of it. A question about the future as we come close to the end of the session from Marcus. And his question is about, well, what does the future look like? Is it more PFIs, unlikely given what the Chancellor has said in the budget, or greater focus on and a greater emphasis on strategic estates partnerships? So what's your view on strategic estates partnerships? Maybe if you could do a little bit of introduction on them as well.
I don't know if I'm best qualified to do that introduction.
I'm just wondering, is it me? Is it? So strategic estates partnerships, I think it's an interesting environment. Obviously, if we're not going to have PFIs, what does that mean? Does that mean a revenue-driven change world? Strategic partnerships to deliver new assets potentially, but actually, if we've got a constrained capital environment and CDAL limits, so restrictions on overall government expenditure borrowing, and we have leases that are on balance sheet, I think it's about doing more with what we have, and we'll only see investment where it's absolutely critical. So I think that it's not just about NHS capital, it's about any sort of investment now will be potentially on balance sheet, and we'll see. So strategic estates partnerships where you're taking long-term leases or moving your portfolio may not actually give us the answer to the question. I think this is still emerging, and we'll see what. It's not altogether clear to me, but I'm not an accountant, how the if the change to the accounting rules will impact, and how many leases are going to go on balance sheet and what that will mean. So I think this is all sort of an emerging conversation, and as is the conversation about subsidiary health estates companies and what that will look like. So sorry, not an answer. I think very much an emergent question, and I think it will really force the issue of what can we dispose of so we can release capital to reinvest, and what can we do most efficiently once across systems. I think those conversations are where we're headed.
And sorry, Adam.
I was just saying, so in terms of what the future looks like, obviously the long-term plan is coming out very soon, but looking a bit further ahead, we've got the comprehensive spending review, which will determine the capital allocation for the Department of Health over the next however many years. And I understand as well there's going to be a kind of an ongoing review around how capital is funded within the NHS as well. And there needs to be a discussion there about kind of what's the right footprint for capital decisions to be made. So we've talked about STPs already, and a lot of STPs are currently over the last kind of few months, it's the STPs that have been the kind of the footprint for capital bids for trusts. When you look at a slightly more kind of even larger scale, you might be looking at more regional decisions if you want to build an entirely new hospital. And then you've obviously got the kind of the more day-to-day kind of capital spending that an individual trust doesn't really have to take into consider the STP in those sorts of decisions. So that there's it's important to, as we talk about the future of capital and the NHS estate, to consider those kind of different tiers or footprints about decision making on funding the estate.
So we're approaching the end of the session, and you've all wrecked my planned closing because it was going to be really downbeat about some of the things we've talked about, the very real restrictions on capital funding, the multiple pressures on boards. But you're starting to win me over with your pragmatic optimism, because whatever the capital limits are, whatever, if PFI is off the table, something else may be on the table, we don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty. But everything you've talked about is making better use of what we have. A lot of things that if you explain to patients or taxpayers, they would say, well, that's what I'd expect from a health service, to use its assets, use technology to make things better for staff, better for patients. So thank you for changing my mind, even if it did ruin what would have been a good, albeit downbeat closing. So thank you very much for tuning in. We've got through quite a few questions, but not all the questions that were asked, and I apologise for that. The good news is we will put these questions to the panel. They will have a chance to review them, and you can keep engaging using the hashtag on Twitter, KFOnline. But all that leaves me to do is say thank you to the panel for their time, and to thank you for tuning in. And wherever you are, enjoy the rest of your day, and goodbye.